Breaking news. Gortat's mum. I really think my son could be his own version of at Shaquille O'Neal and Patrick Ewing. He got the right tools and age. Hashtag thanks mum. Hashtag I love you. Hashtag number one mum. Hashtag for real.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily podcast on fantasy basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_Bebo. In today's show, we're going to be looking at the NBA schedule. The full schedule was released over the weekend, and I know a lot of people put a lot of importance on this in fantasy basketball. Me, maybe not so much as what a lot of people do, but we're going to be talking about all the things related to the schedule. You can check out our schedule grid up on Basketball Monster now as well. A reminder, Basketball Monster memberships will be open the 1st of September for this coming season as we're going through all the projections and preseason content at the moment. But the schedule grid is there, available for you there. Michael Bolton, he's ready.
Let's get to it.
Let's get to it indeed. Thank you to everyone who has submitted their applications for the Analyst versus Listener League. I've got the first 3 of those spots sorted at the moment. The next couple of spots I'm going to do, in order to qualify for this, I want you to go and find a social media post of this show, whether that's on Facebook, whether that's on Instagram, whether that's on Twitter, and I need you to either share it on Facebook. I need you to either quote tweet it on Twitter, or to share it on Instagram and tag me in it there as well. And if you do that, you will get into the draw to get one of these next 2 spots to get into this league. 7 analysts versus 7 listeners. Myself, Greg Ehrenberg, Kyle McEwen, Matt Smith, Adam King, Alex Rickleen, and there's someone else that I'm completely thinking. Oh, Seth Klein. Sorry about that, Seth. From Fantrax is going to be the analysts in the league, and you can jump in those leagues. So either quote tweet it, either share it on Facebook, or go ahead and share it on Instagram. The post for today's show, go and do that, and you can get yourself into this league. It's going to be a Roto league, and see who's got the right stuff, the analysts or the listeners to this podcast. Let's talk about the schedule. As I said, it came out amazingly. Every team plays 41 games at home, 41 games on the road. Actually, that's a lie, because some teams play in London and some teams play in Mexico City. But I think you know what I mean. Everyone's got those 82 games, but how are those 82 games thrown throughout the schedule? Where do they fall? Where do we find them positioned, and how can we take advantage of this? Now, some people, man, I only draft for playoff schedule. Some people have this legit mentality, and it's great, but if you don't get to the playoffs, it doesn't mean jack shit. So if you're just loading up on guys who play 4-4-4s throughout the playoffs, and you miss out through the season because you're holding on to these guys who may be struggling, or you've made deals to get these players, and they have a run up to the playoffs of having 5 weeks in a row of 3 games, so you're losing all that playing time there, then maybe you don't get into the playoffs. So I don't put massive focus on it. I do pay some attention, especially with the upper end guys in drafts, when I'm looking at the playoffs and there are guys that have comparable talents, which guy I'm going to draft with a high pick, whether that's a first round pick. So a guy like Karl Anthony Towns in a lot of leagues had a really shit playoff schedule last season. So he was someone that I was avoiding in most circumstances, just because he'd play 3 or 4 fewer games over the playoff period than some other teams. And that's a huge disadvantage for guys like your upper echelon guys who are going to be playing every night. Towards the back end of the draft, I pay absolutely zero attention to playoff schedule when making picks. It's all about trying to get the guy that's going to jump 20, 30 spots up, looking for upside in that spot, and playoff schedule should play absolutely zero part in any selection you're making at the end of drafts. In fact, the decision I'm making there, that a lot of those spots are going to be streaming spots where you try and maximize games played per week. And then when you get to the playoffs, you're doing the exact same thing. Who's got more games that particular week? Can I add them in? Can I stream them in? But even more important than that is, when are those games played? Are they on high volume days? Are they on low volume days? Because you'll hear me talk about the concept of quality games really, really often. And what that means is, a quality game is a day in the NBA when there are limited games on, meaning that any player you have on your fantasy team that plays in one of those games, you're going to be able to fit them into your active list. Now, in general, a Wednesday in the NBA might have 11 games, might have 12 games. So therefore, for 10 active spots on your fantasy roster, you might actually have 12 active players. So there are two guys that are sitting there with games that you can't actually utilize. Whereas in essence, if they played on the Tuesday or if they played on the Thursday when there might be 6 games on or 7 games on, you can fit them into your active lineup, making that way more valuable than, say, someone, a 4-game week where someone plays Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday as a low-end guy is nowhere near as impactful as a 3-game week where someone plays Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday, because you can actually get 3 games out of those guys, whereas opposed to that guy who plays Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, you might actually get 0 games where you can use that player. So it is all about being smart in that regard, more for the back end of your draft. So when you're looking at the top end of your draft, yeah, you can have a look at playoff schedule and have a look at where these games are played down the pointy end of the season. And when you're making trades through the year, you can try and scrounge an extra 1 or 2 games because, as I tweeted out the other day, the difference in value, in projected value at this point in my projection process between pick 3 and pick 11 is not even anywhere near as big as the gap between 2 and 3. So whatever guy you pick in that first round, you could make decisions of going big for punt builds or scarcity, or you could just go, well, this guy plays 2 extra playoff games through my fantasy playoffs. The value here is really, really close, and it could very easily swing if someone misses an extra 4 shots over the season. That value could actually be changed, that amount, to move them from 10th to 5th. I know that's exaggeration, but you get what I mean. So making that decision there is something that you can do. But when you get past round 3, round 4 even, I don't think taking too much into consideration with playoff schedule in drafting is all that necessary. I'd be more looking at quality games. And I look at playoff games when looking at maybe waiver wire situations, maybe trades when you get to January, maybe February, but nothing in the draft process for those later round picks should pay any attention to that. Before we get on to looking at the playoff schedule for teams, let's take a look at how these quality games play out. And there are some significant differences. Now, Basketball Monster uses a default of 5 games, meaning any day where there are 5 games or less, it qualifies as a quality game. I actually go higher than that. I set my default on my leagues to 8 quality games. And the reason I've done that is because nearly every time when I look at it, if there is a day where 8 games are, unless you've got really poor positional balance in your roster, if there is a day with 8 games or fewer on there, you will be able to fit every player on your roster into an active spot, assuming that you have a 10-13 split. And by 10-13 split, I mean a 13-man total roster and 10 of those are active. So 10 over 13. The way I work out that 8-game stretch is you look at 10 over 13, what percentage is of that, what's that percentage? And then I look at, okay, so if I've got a maximum amount of games can played as 15, what's a similar percentage of 10 over 13 versus X over 15? It ends up about 9 point something, and I just take it down 1 to be safe and make it 8. So if your setup is different, where you've got 5 starters and 13 total, then obviously you're going to have a lot more guys stuck on your bench during the week. So 8's not going to work for you. So you go 5 of 13. What does that equal? Out of 15 max games, does that equal a quality game level of 6? Or is it a quality game of 5? So that's the way that you can adjust that number for your particular league setting. And I do suggest you do that because it does change things quite a bit. Now, based on my default of 8, which is a default for me for 12-team leagues, 10 starters, 13 total roster spots, when you're looking at these quality games, who comes out as the winner? Well, the Golden State Warriors have 49 of these games on low volume days, which in general is Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. There'll be some Mondays in there. Wednesday and Friday usually not, but it's normally going to be Tuesday, Thursday, Monday, Saturday, Sunday are the days that normally fall in this zone. The Golden State Warriors have 49, so over half of their games are on those low volume days. Contrast and compare that with the Chicago Bulls and the Cleveland Cavaliers, who have 31 of these games. That is 18 games difference. Now, that is not an insignificant amount. So, while we know Draymond Green, we know Steph Curry, we know Kevin Durant, we know all those guys there, and there's not really anyone on Chicago who's getting drafted in similar rounds to those players on Cleveland or on Chicago. But when you're looking at maybe Kevon Looney late in a draft over, say, a Larry Nance or a Tristan Thompson, that might be more important because that might mean that, assuming that your roster stays tight the whole season, which it it probably won't do, but if it does, you could potentially get an extra 18 games out of someone like Looney versus someone like Nance on the Cavs, or someone like Robin Lopez in a deeper format for the Bulls, or Punch Bob Shiplock, or Jabari Parker, or anyone along those lines, or even Kevin Love to a degree, although he is a guy that, because he's so high up the rankings, it's not really going to be too much of a difference. But you're comparing him to, say, a Draymond Green, both likely second to third round players. Which one do you take? The guy that you know you're going to be sliding into 18 more times on those low volume days, freeing up other days for other guys? That's a consideration that you do have to make. There are other teams who do play some significant amounts. Denver has 47 quality games. The Clippers have 48 there as well. The Portland Trailblazers, the Sacramento Kings both have 48. You've got the Lakers and the Rockets with 46 quality games as well. And on the lower side, you've got the Mavericks come in at 33, which is obviously a disappointingly low amount for those guys, not as bad as the Cavs. Or the Bulls. A couple others with 30s, 37 for the Indiana Pacers for this season. Also 36 for the Pelicans, 38 for the Wolves, 35 for the Heat, and 34 for the Grizzlies. So we're talking 15 games or so difference over the course of the season. Quality games are more important when looking at a weekly streaming basis, and of course Matt Smith does his weekly streaming article on Basketball Monster every week. I cover it on the podcast as well, which teams play more games but play more usable games, and which players are you going to be able to utilize there. But it is something to pay attention to in your draft when looking at these guys, and when looking at how best you're going to be able to pick them and get the most value out of these players. I think that is important to be able to have a look at that. Now, of course, Yahoo Fantasy Basketball at the time of recording this podcast isn't out, so we don't know exactly what their default playoff schedule is going to be. One thing I will say is I know the NBA, and this shits me a lot, and more than it should really. The NBA has come out and they've gone with a fantasy-friendly nomenclature in terms of weeks. Like, let's name each week 1, week 2, week 3, and that's great. It ties in with the football crowd, with fantasy football, with going with fantasy. This is week 1, this is week 2. The problem is that you get to the All-Star break, ESPN, Yahoo, they combine those into 1 week. So therefore, weeks 18 and 19 become week 18. The NBA doesn't. It's still week 18, week 19. So when you get to the NBA schedule, it says week 20. That's different to Yahoo's, which is then week 19, or ESPN's, which is week 19. So in the end, referring to things by weeks is confusing, because then you got to go, are you talking about NBA week 19, or are you talking about ESPN week 19? Like, it's a great idea, but get your shit together. Like, make it the same. So ESPN and Yahoo, on that All-Star break, it should be called week 18/19. As simple as that. And then the next week's week 20. Very, very easy. But the confusion there of combining those two into 1 week just completely destroys that whole idea of having the league schedule set out to be fantasy friendly, because in the end you make it unfantasy friendly, and you can't really use those descriptors for weeks. So when I talk about playoff weeks, and if you're ever tweeting at me, my playoffs are week 22, 23, don't. Because because I'm going to have to come back, what do you actually mean by this week? Are you talking NBA week 22 or ESPN week 22? Tell me dates. Dates is what I'm going to be going on here. Now, my assumption is that Yahoo is going to have their fantasy playoffs, the 3-week fantasy playoffs, which is their default, starting on the 11th of March for the first round, 18th of March for the second round, 25th of March for the third round, and that would mean that the last day of the season there is the 31st of March. ESPN, of course, goes through until the end of the season. Bullshit. Don't ever play a single game in fantasy basketball in April. Don't ever do it. If your league does it, quit it. Don't start a league. Change it. Do not play a single fantasy basketball game in April. Straightforward. Make the last day that you do the 31st of March. Now, Yahoo could also come out and have their default setting run from the 18th of March starting, the week of the 25th, and the week of the 1st of April. But I think more likely it'll go the 11th, the 18th, and the 25th, which are NBA weeks 22, 23, 24. But who knows whether that's actually what Yahoo's going to measure it at. In all of the Red Rock Challenge leagues, whether that's the head-to-head leagues or the points leagues, the leagues with playoffs, we go with a much more expanded playoffs. We start them on February the 25th. The first round of the playoffs goes for 1 week. And then we have 2-week playoffs from March the 4th to March the 17th is the next round, and March the 18th to March the 31st is the final round. So a 5-week playoffs as opposed to Yahoo, which does 3 weeks. And as you'll see as I go through this, having those extra weeks, the multi-playoff weeks, it actually reduces the impact of the extra games played and stretches it out quite a bit. I think it's a fairer way to do things. It reduces variance, and if your team has been good through the season, of course, when you're in a situation, if you drafted Kristaps Porzingis or Boogie Cousins last year, which I did in one league, and then lost them both, you've got no hope of coming back losing your first 2 picks in that sort of a scenario. But it does help if a guy misses 1 or 2 games. You can easily catch up. The games played discrepancy tends to even up over a 2-week period as well. So let's have a look at how the playoff schedule looks. This is for what I do believe will be the Yahoo default playoff situation, and that is starting from the 11th of March through to the 31st of March. There are only 2 teams that play 12 games in that time, the 4-4-4. The Kings and the Wizards both have 4 games there. So that does elevate someone like Brad Beal, like Johnny Wall, pretty much no one on the Kings, because they're probably going to struggle to have a top 50 guy. Maybe it's Budrick, maybe De'Aaron Fox takes a big step forward and becomes that guy, but they're unlikely to have someone way up the top there. But it does give some ability for guys like Bogdan Bogdanovic. Maybe it is Willie Cauley-Stein, maybe it is Skal Labissiere, maybe it's Marvin Bagley towards the end of the season that you can have a look at and get some value. And the good thing with the Kings is not only do they have those 12 games in fantasy playoffs, but they do play 48 quality games throughout the season as well, the second highest number behind the Golden State Warriors. So hopefully you can get those guys and actually use them. So despite having your low value on their guys, and maybe they only have 2 top 100 guys this season, there's a chance they're going to have 4. You could have Cauley-Stein, you could have Bogdanovic, you could have Hield, you could have Fox, and maybe you could have Bagley. Maybe there's 5. You could also have 0 as well on that team. But those 2 factors, the 12 games plus the 48 quality games, does give them a little bit of a boost that some people may not be aware of. The Wizards, as I said, it's a boost for Wall, it's a boost for Beal, maybe it's a boost for someone like Dwight Howard or even Otto Porter in that situation there also, but they jump into that spot. Now, in terms of teams with 11 games, there's a few of those in that 3-week period. The Cavs, the Nuggets, the Pistons, the Rockets, the Clippers, the Lakers, the Thunder, and the Jazz, they all have 11 games during that time frame. And then you've got a whole bunch of teams with 10. Celtics, Hornets, Mavs, Warriors, Pacers, Heat, Bucks, Blazers, Spurs, Raptors. There's nothing all that exciting there, although I will mention that in that time frame, the Golden State Warriors have a 2-game week and they have a 5-game week. So the first week of Yahoo playoffs, the Warriors have 2 games. The second week, they have 5 games. So you might look at that and go, that's great. I think I'm going to get a bye in that first week of Yahoo playoffs, and you're going to eliminate that. But if you draft KD, if you draft Steph, if you draft Draymond, and you're looking at it for that benefit, and they only play 2 games in that first week, maybe you don't get out of the first week. And then the next factor that's got to come in is they play 5 games the next week. What's the chances of them playing all 5 of those games? I'd say less than 20%. There is less than 20% chance that Durant, Thompson, Curry, and Draymond, all 4 of those guys, play those 5 games that week. And of course, there is 0 chance that DeMarcus Cousins will play all 5 games that week. So their 10 games is a little bit misleading just because of the way it's scheduled too. If it was a 4-4-3, you'd go, you know what, that I can get 10 games out of my Warriors there. 2-5-3, well, maybe I only get 9 games, and that pushes them right down the bottom of the list here of teams for that default or alleged or presumed default Yahoo playoff weeks. So the teams that have the bad schedule there, and there's quite a lot of them, the Hawks, the Nets, the Bulls, the Grizzlies, the Wolves, Pelicans, Knicks, Magic, Sixers, and Suns all have 9 games, and 4 of those teams have 2-game weeks. The Brooklyn Nets have a 2-game week in the second round of the playoffs. The Grizzlies have a 2-game week at the start of the playoffs. The Knicks have a 2-game week in championship week, so that's important if you're getting all aboard the Fort Kevin Knox. If you're looking at It's a Me Mario Hezonja, if you're looking at Enes Kanter, 2 games in championship week, maybe that's important to you. And then the Magic in round 2 also have only 2 games. So those things, they are fairly important to pay attention to when you're looking at that. Look, that can be a real impact. But of course, if you draft a guy like Enes Kanter or even Kristaps Porzingis, the idea of you drafting Kristaps Porzingis is to hold for the NBA, for the fantasy playoffs. Oh man, I can get into the playoffs. And then you get there, he only plays 9 games, and in one of those weeks it's 2. What's the point of that? And I think that's really important to note, is that the only reason you'd be drafting someone like Porzingis, and to a degree DeMarcus Cousins, is for fantasy playoffs, and their schedules aren't ideal for either of them. So you might only be getting 8 games out of Boogie across those playoffs. You might only get 8 games out of Porzingis, even with a 2-game week. Maybe he sits one of those weeks there as well, because I believe the Knicks have a 4-game week as well. Yeah, they go 3-4-2. So maybe you get 3-3-2 out of Porzingis, and if you're drafting him any higher than pick 100 and you don't have an IR spot, you're just wasting your time, because what is the advantage there when there are teams like the Kings and the Wizards who could potentially be playing 4 more games over that time frame? So that is something that is worth paying attention to, I believe. Let's look at the other potential situation here. If the default situation, or if your league runs from the 18th of March to the 7th of April, things are a little bit different, but one name does reappear there, and that's the Sacramento Kings, who do play 12 games in this period as well. The Nuggets also have 12 games, and the Warriors go from being one of the worst with 10 to being one of the best with 12. But of course, we have to look at that and go, there is that 5-game week in the first round of that playoffs, and you're not going to get 5 out of Cousins and Steph and KD and Clay. Are you going to get it? They go 5-3-4, whereas the Nuggets and Kings are all 4-4-4. So that Warriors 12-game week, it's not made the same as the Nuggets 12-game playoffs. It's not made the same as the Nuggets 12-game playoffs. It's not made the same as the Kings 12-game playoffs. The other teams with 11, we've got the Celtics, the Hornets, the Cavs, the Mavs, the Pistons, the Rockets, and the Pacers have also got 11 games. Basically, every team during this time frame has got 11. There's a whole chunk of them. Lakers, Heat, Bucks, Blazers, Spurs, Raptors, Jazz, and Wizards all have 11 games as well over that time frame. And then the teams with the not as attractive schedules, we've got the Hawks, the Clippers, the Grizzlies, the Wolves, the Knicks, the Thunder, the Magic, the Sixers, and the Suns all have 10 games, while the Bulls, Pelicans, and Nets only have 9. And of course, comparing a Nuggets player to a Pelicans player, whether you're looking at let's give myself an example. Whether you're looking at Julius Randle versus Paul Millsap, you might have 12 games for the Nuggets, you might have 9 games for the Pelicans. Is that enough of a deciding factor to make you go Millsap over Randle? It could be, or Nikola Mirotic. That is something to pay attention to. There are, in this 18th of March to 7th of April proposed playoff schedule, apart from the Warriors having 5 games, there are 3 teams that have 2-game weeks. One of them is the Knicks, who would have 2 games in round 2. The Magic have 2 games in round 1, and the Nets have 2 games in round 1 as well. So they are obviously not ideal type scenarios. There are quite a few 2-game weeks sprinkled throughout the season. There are a couple of 1-game weeks sprinkled throughout the season as well, which we'll talk about in a second. But what I do want to focus on now is the Red Rock Challenge leagues, the guys who are in all my head-to-head leagues, whether that's categories or points, and the way that I run my schedule with that the playoffs starting on the 25th of February. The important thing I believe to note here is I talked about those proposed 2 Yahoo default leagues starting the 11th of March or the 18th of March. The most games you had was 12. The fewest you had was 9. So a 3-game difference over 3 weeks, right? Which is, it's there. It's enough to make somewhat of a difference. You look at the Red Rock Challenge, which is a 5-week playoffs. The difference between games there is 3 at most. And in fact, it's only for 29 teams, they're within 2 games over a 5-week period. So it basically evens right out. That to me is a fairer way of doing the playoffs. As opposed to 3-game difference over 3 weeks, we're talking about a 2-game difference over 5 weeks, which is basically the same thing. But I'm still going to go through the teams whose schedule does look a little bit nicer when looking at those playoff scenarios. You've got the Pistons, the Rockets, the Lakers, the Heat, the Bucks, the Thunder, the Kings, and the Wizards. They all play 18 games over that 5-game period, or 5-week period. Then the bulk of those teams play 17 games. You've got the Hawks, the Celtics, the Hornets, Bulls, Cavs, Mavs, Nuggets, Warriors, Pacers, Clippers, Wolves, Pelicans, Blazers, Jazz. Of course, there are 2-game weeks thrown in there, so and 5-game weeks. So teams like the Warriors do have that value reduced because of that. And then at the bottom end of things in that Red Rock Challenge League, you've got the Nets, the Grizzlies, the Knicks, the Sixers, the Suns, the Spurs, and the Raptors playing 16, and the lowly Magic play 15. Now, again, that 15, it stands out, and you look at the teams like the Pistons and the Rockets that play 18, and it's 3 games difference. But it's 3 games spread over 5 weeks. More importantly is when those games occur, when everything occurs, and moving guys in and out. But I think that is a fair way of doing playoffs. And again, I do implore you, in your home leagues, don't play into April. That is the number one thing. The number two thing is expand your playoffs. Make it 2 weeks per matchup. Now, what I did, and this is something that you do have the ability to do on Fantrax, is make it so that the first round is 1 week, almost like the old NBA playoffs. Best of 5 first round, then best of 7 after that. You can make the first round be 1 week and the other 2 rounds be 2 weeks. Or, the first round 1 week and the next 3 rounds 2 weeks, depending on how your league is set up and how many teams are in it. I like that scenario. You could also do it that each week is 2 weeks in the playoffs, and another way of doing it. But I do think having a 2-week playoffs is a better way to go in a lot of situations. I know some of the old Dynasty leagues I've got are 1 week playoffs, but most of the new ones I've set up have been 2 weeks for this particular reason, with this new feature that Fantrax has introduced, but by being able to have that split system of 1 week for round 1 and then 2 weeks for the other 2 rounds, or 3 rounds, depending on how you're setting it up. But as you can see, the equity or the equitability between the teams over 5 weeks is exactly the same, a 3-game difference, as it is over those 3-week periods for Yahoo default. And spread over 5 weeks, it's much, much less impactful when looking at that. So, when you're looking at things, your teams, overall, if we're going to go back to Yahoo default, the teams we're looking at it as in worse situations. The Nets and the Knicks don't look ideal. The Grizzlies don't have a great run of things through the playoffs there as well. The Bulls and Pelicans look pretty shithouse, whereas the Warriors are sort of in the middle, but that probably could turn worse with that 5-game week. You're trying to avoid the 2-game week teams, which is the Nets, Grizzlies, Knicks, and Magic as well, while the Kings and Wizards sit atop with 12 games over that 3-week period. Now, as I mentioned, there are a couple of teams who do play 1-game weeks during the season. You've got the Pistons with a 1-game week at some stage early in the season. You've got the Knicks and the Wizards with a 1-game week. I'm not including the All-Star festivities or the end of the season in that last 3 days of the year where some teams only have 1 game. But there are, the Knicks and the Wizards, I believe that's the London game that those guys are playing. They've got a 1 game that week. There is also the Blazers who have a 1-game week at the end of January also. So you've got 4, outside of the All-Star week, you've got 4 teams who play 1-game weeks. The Knicks, the Wizards, the Blazers, and the Pistons all have a 1-game week in periods during the season, and that's all before the All-Star break. After the All-Star break, there are no teams that have those 1-game weeks. Another interesting thing to look at the schedule is that the Cleveland Cavaliers actually have 16 of their 26 weeks where they play the most games possible that week. So I think that's an interesting development. On the low side of things, you've got a few that only have 13 of those. We're talking about the Blazers, the Suns, the Lakers, the Clippers, the Warriors, and the Celtics. So they only have 13 of those, so half of their weeks where they play the maximum amount of weeks possible. That means that they're more likely to have 2s and 5s rather than a lot of 4s in there. But of course, you've got to then weigh it up with how do those quality games look and how does it all work. Now, I do stress this often, putting an undue amount of attention onto playoff schedule can screw you. So much changes during the season. Your team will be 30, 40% different by the end of the year. You will make trades. Now, you can pay some attention to it if there's guys who you have completely equal. Which one am I going to go to, especially at the pointy end of the draft? That's important. But playing the schedule on a week-to-week basis is way more important than playing the schedule during a draft. Having a look at how I can use my waiver wire and having expendable spots to get guys on the right days with extra games against the right opponents is way more important than making a pick at pick 95 during a draft, because this guy plays 3 extra playoff games over 3 weeks in March, when who knows if they're going to be on your team, who knows if they're going to be hurt. And even these guys with great playoff schedules, maybe it's the Wizards, maybe Johnny Wall's hurt by then, maybe the Wizards are so far out of it they're resting guys. Absolutely anything can happen at this point. Just like the Warriors, you look at it and go, man, only one team's got a 5-game week and it's the Warriors. Bang, Steph, bang, KD, let's go. They're not playing those games. They're not playing all 5 of them. Zero chance they play all 5 of them. They'll play 4 of them, probably, but they're not playing all 5 of them. Plus, the week before, they played 2. So that 5-game week looks great in isolation. Oh, man, I'm going to kill it. Second round of the playoffs, 5 games. Probably ends up being 4. The week before, you got 2, and that's 6 games over 2 weeks, and it's decidedly average. So everything you look at is all about context. There's multiple contexts to every single thing that we look at in fantasy. That's what makes it so fun, is there are so many ways to look at it, and it's never just, bang, look at this, grab this guy. It's why I talk about rankings and why I hate them. I hate rankings, people go, can you rank these guys? It's never about that. It's about context. It's about how these guys fit, how scarce is this position, is this statistical category, how scarce is that, what guys am I going to get next, am I getting value for this player? That's why I never have a new do not draft list. That's why I never want to just go, well, I'm ranking this guy 42 and this guy's 43. 42 is definitely better than 43 because in essence, the guys between 40 and 60 are about the same. There's slight differences, there's marginal differences. I can prefer guys here and there based on what they do, but it's never as cut and dried in that. And it goes down to the schedule as well, and context is required in all of that. And I hope that's what I try and, that is what I try and do in this podcast, and I hope it comes through in providing context to all these situations. Again, remember, another 2 spots available for the Analyst versus Listener League. To do that, quote tweet the tweet announcing this podcast. Share the post on Facebook or go ahead and share it on Instagram as well, and then you'll be in running for one of the next 2 spots available for the Analyst versus Listener Leagues, which will be a Roto League. And you can see if you're smarter than all us analysts who'll be doing this league as well. Guys, tomorrow we're going to be doing a mailbag podcast, so stay tuned for that, where I answer some of your questions, some very interesting questions in there as well that you guys have submitted. Go and subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Google Play, on TuneIn, and on Stitcher, and on YouTube. Subscribe, thumbs up, leave a comment. You know how to do it. Get yourself in the Analyst versus Listener League. Check out the rest of the Locked On Podcast Network, including our upcoming Locked On College podcast series, which will be coming in the next couple of weeks. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya. Marcin Gortat.